Hey, so here on Wednesday, January 18th, we are just doing a little reflection on the verses that we've covered the last couple of days. Verses 16, 17, and 18 of the Dao De Jing. Sage says about verse 16, she calls out this line, "Watch the turmoil of beings, but contemplate their return." She says, I discussed it with two of my closest friends of 30 plus years as we've been through a lot together. It's a wonderful reminder that all things are temporary. We can learn so much through suffering and turmoil, but the return is the heart of the lesson, at least for me. I love that. This idea of the turmoil and the return, it resonates throughout all of 16. He says each separate being in the universe returns to the common source. Returning to the source is serenity. If you don't realize the source, you stumble in confusion and sorrow. And when you do, he then goes on to describe basically the experience of the master, of somebody who moves through the world with a confidence and a serenity. So this, and I love the way that Sage talks about it, putting it into applying it to her own personal life and her personal relationships. And when you've been friends with somebody for 30 years, or really even doing anything for a long time, maybe in your career or whatever, you start to gain that wise perspective of being able to see that through all the ups and downs, there is this cycle of return. And no matter how far out we feel from that, the return will still come eventually, inevitably. And that hindsight that we have in those long relationships really helps us see that. This book is full of dualities, and Holly speaks to this a little. I'll go ahead and talk about her really, I think, wise comment as well. But pointing out that this idea of like we can watch something, that there's this duality in the world, and sort of making peace with that is a huge, just continual theme of the Dao De Jing. That both of these things are true. I can look around the world and see turmoil and chaos and sadness and injustice. I see all of these things. And I can also contemplate. And this contemplation is me sort of bringing in the wisdom. We're trying to soak in this wisdom every single day so that it becomes part of our body, so that it's easier and easier to bring up these reminders. Oh, I'm seeing this suffering, and yet I can also remember that being came from serenity and will return to serenity. Maybe not while I'm physically watching them right now. I might just see the turmoil, but I understand the nature of things. That's the gift of the wisdom of the Tao, is that it gives us that perspective. Holly says, I see two main themes, emptiness and source. The verses move through the paradoxes of needing to let go to the nothing and to realize the source. And she says she's struggling with how to summarize it, but I think that does speak to it. And I want you guys to watch for this throughout, because now we have this perspective of 81 days of little bit by bit seeing these verses. You are going to pick up on the deep teachings and themes that really appear for you in this. Just finishing up verse 16. Immersed in the wonder of the Tao, you can deal with whatever life brings you. And when death comes, you are ready. Okay, so verse 17, and this is great. Pamela is just bringing up her something she wants to discuss from this. Yeah, okay. So when the master governs, the people are hardly aware that he exists. So the master is the highest example in the Dao De Jing of it's an enlightened being. Now, next best is a leader who is loved. Next one who is feared, the worst is one who's despised. So he gives 4 examples of leaders. And Pamela is saying this really interesting thing. She says, I'm contemplating why the one who we're not even aware that he exists is better than the one that's loved. Very, very astute observation here, because that's, again, a paradox. Holly mentions these paradoxes. We are going to find this throughout. I'm so glad you guys brought this up. Several people are typing, which tells me, Pamela, you're not alone. Okay. Now Jenny's jumping in the discussion. She says, it's because the master gets you to know that you did it yourself. I love that. Thank you, Jenny. That's definitely in alignment with my interpretation of it. This verse is really short, so I'll just go through it. He says, if you don't trust the people, you make them untrustworthy. The master doesn't talk, he acts. When his work is done, the people say, amazing, we did it all by ourselves. So if we think about, so we're now into this phase of the book where he's talking more and more about leaders and what it means to be a leader. And at the beginning, we were hearing more about the Dao itself. What is the Dao? And what we're finding is basically what he described as the Dao. Now, the master is the human embodiment of the Dao, or you might say the universe, or if it's helpful to wrap your head around, you could even just say sort of Mother Nature, or the way of nature, the nature of things. And if we think about how nature supports us, the breath isn't always going, hey, excuse me, have you noticed how I'm making life possible? Do you love me? Right? The earth underneath us isn't going, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? The rain that makes life possible. It's so humble in its way. He talks about it as being subtle, invisible. The things that are actually the most powerful have no sense of self or ego. He also describes this, right? When he talks about how if you're stuck on the self, you can't love all things. We are learning about a kind of deeper kind of love that has no ego, right? When I want to be loved and appreciated and gotten attention, I want to be a good leader to you guys. That's one thing. But wanting to be loved by you is actually a desire for myself. And as we've learned, the Tao has no desire for itself. That's why it can be everything, everywhere. So more to contemplate, but I think that's something that you can contemplate in your own relationships. I imagine none of you are governors of a country or anything, but you have your relationships. In those relationships, are you more concerned about being loved? That's an ego thing. Or are you actually concerned about the experience of those around you, letting them come into their own sense of empowerment? I think being a parent, this could also be kind of a parent manual in a way, right? It sounds like this is resonating. Okay. So let's move on to verse 18, and any of this that you want to loop back around about, or as some of you I think are doing, just make your own comment about, please put it in. Yeah, getting some nods to a parent manual. If we could master, the master, the governor, the leader of our household, how do we do that? Okay. And then Judy just specifically said, could you just explain today's verse? And it's a nice short one, so I'll just go ahead and read it again, and I'll give you what I can from it, and then send it back your way to contemplate further. Now, this is an interesting one. This is also a kind of a paradigm that he uses throughout of this. When this happens, this happens. He's showing us cause and effect. And often the cause and effect that we see that he shows us can seem paradoxical. So he says, when the great Dao is forgotten, when that subtle, natural, everywhere, everything aspect is forgotten, goodness and piety appear. When the body's intelligence declines, cleverness and knowledge step forth. When there is no peace in the family, filial piety begins. When the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born. Okay, so you see the pattern. He sets up this pattern, and then he gives you 4 examples of the same type of thing happening in different aspects of life. And he's giving us these things that on their own might seem positive. Goodness and piety. What's wrong with that? But again, we need to go back to this theme of that when the true nature of things is in play, we actually don't need any artifice. We don't need oh, thank you. Thank you. Piety, yeah, piety means essentially purity, like a religious or spiritual purity. Oh, and then Pamela also says like reverence, but pious versus sinful, you could say. Yes, piety is a religious word. It comes from a religious context, and piety, it means like a moral purity. It's a moral term. Yeah, and righteousness could be that. Yeah, and we'll see some more of this kind of talk throughout, and talk that could seem actually quite like what he's saying here, blasphemous. If anybody was very dogmatic about their religion, this thing could seem very offensive. And this verse is not alone. He's pushing buttons for anybody who is kind of towing a religious or moral line. I mean, he later uses the very word morality, and he says morality is a problem. When morality is there, she's saying here, basically, like if you're being overly moral, like what does it mean if you're very pious, right? It means that you probably look down on people who aren't. You've created this dualism, this hierarchy where there's the good people and there's the bad people. And so, and here's another theme. Anytime that we have one thing, we also bring its opposite. He says this in the verse before. You will make people untrustworthy by not trusting them. So as soon as I say, I am the most pious ever, check this out in your personal relationships. As soon as you take a higher stance, watch as other people kind of want to poke you from underneath, right? They might become a little more sinful around you because in response to that, and he says this a lot, you will create crime by assuming that, by creating prisons in a way, right? Like if you assume that you are the morality police, suddenly you will have a lot to police. Yes, piety is to some degree posturing. Yes. You guys are starting to, I think, get it. This is a really big theme, and we're just at 18, but all our way through 81, you guys are going to keep picking this up. Pamela says the cultural norms are huge going into this. Yes, as we get deeper in, it feels harder and more real. That's right. Cultural norms are going to we're going to brush up against them because we're going to see that is part of our conditioning that makes us unable to see ourselves as the Tao. Because cultural norms are specific to time and places. The Tao is not. Okay, I think that this one's maybe a little more understandable in a way, or I've got an easy way to relate this, okay? Especially for us yogis. When the body's intelligence declined, cleverness and knowledge stepped forth. I've been on a big healing journey. And as I've become less, then I got to a place where I was less in touch with my body. And I needed the cleverness and the knowledge of doctors and the internet. And turns out there's all this outer interpretation of what's going on with my autoimmune issues. Um, and essentially, what's going on in my body is kind of attacking itself. My body's kind of integrity and harmony, probably just through years of stress, you know, and probably maybe some other factors, but the body's intelligence and integrity started to decline, and lo and behold, what what do I need to come to rely on? More artifice, more external. Um, I think this one's really interesting. When there's no peace in the family, filial piety begins. I have a side of my family, a part of my family that, or like loyalty is really huge, and like never speaking about it's sort of like posturing and holding face and like putting on a good face to the world is really important. And what I find is within that family, part of the family, I have a very hard time having real discussions. I don't actually have a lot of intimacy with those family members of that branch. It's kind of more about what we look like on the outside, and then that loyalty becomes more and more important. Don't say anything negative about so and so. That's your family. Don't, and being real becomes less important than that identity. And then that brings us right into the last lines of when the country falls into chaos, patriotism is born. Interesting. Very interesting. Right. And again, if this can feel blasphemous to certain people, right? Patriotism is the most important thing. And what he's saying is it only becomes so important if just the natural love for your land and your community and your culture is threatened somehow. When things become funky, we get righteous and pious. We get very attached to our identities. We get attached to what we look like on the outside. How old is this book? It's amazing how current it is. I know, right? This is from 500 BC. This book is, I don't know what year it is. This book is almost 3,000 years old. Isn't that amazing? Right? And I could talk more about this at some point, but Lao Tzu, there's myths. It's so old that we don't really know the facts about the person who wrote this, but Lao Tzu just means old boy. He wasn't, uh, he was humble himself, and the idea is that he was a scholar, but he basically left that life, and as he was leaving that life and was basically going off into the woods to live out there, he someone stopped him at the gate, and the myth is that he then recited this whole thing. He's that somebody said, give us all your wisdom that you can before you peace out on this society, because that one, like this one, he found so much um um of what we're seeing today, and what he's kind of speaking of here, so much uh what's the word I'm looking for, people, lack of sincerity, lack of earnestness, lack of wisdom, really. um I'm gonna call it right there. That was a little longer than I meant to go, so I'm gonna go ahead and close this reflection for today. But I really love where we went today, and I love what we're getting into. And as Pam said, as we get deeper into the book, some of these themes can be hard. So I just love that we can do this. And anybody who's watching or listening, I I hope that you participate in some way. Leave a comment, reach out to me. And Pamela Zygmunt says, "As above, so below, fractal existence." Yes, that is very much part of the teachings of this book, is the idea that the way of the Tao is the way we want to be in our personal lives. And the wise ways of the greater universe are our ways. That's exactly where we come from. And returning to that source, realizing that we are of that source, that's serenity. Thank you all so much. I'll see you tomorrow.